Great. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our Spring Perspectives event on AI regulation in the UK and EU insurance sectors. Thank you very much for joining us online and here in person. It's amazing to see a smattering of people who've made their way to Canary Wharf, and we're very grateful that you made it to come and see us. Your participation is hugely welcome, so please, if you have a question for the presenters, for those online, I think you can type your question into the Q&A panel at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. We'll also take questions from the audience as well, and I'll make sure that with about 10 minutes to go, we've got time, so please be prepped for that, everybody. For those of you who require a New York CLE credit, the verification code will be announced during the session. So, the insurance industry is believed to be among those with the highest potential value from AI technologies, which, according to McKinsey, could add a potential $1.1 trillion annually. So, no pressure on the question. So I was sort of always thinking about the $1 million question, but it turns out it's the $1.1 trillion question today. Along with the opportunities offered by Gen AI come risks around data protection, confidentiality, threat of cyber attack, ethical concerns, and liability exposure. So it's really around, today I want to explore, I think, the exciting opportunities that come with it, but also the challenges, or as David mentioned, sort of the thrills and the terrors that come in the territory. I'm delighted to have on the panel with me today 4 experts from across the insurtech industry. So first to my right, we have Melissa Collett, who is CEO of Insurtech UK and has 25 years of experience in the sector in raising standards in insurance and financial services. She's a creator of a digital ethics companion and a thought leader on AI and insurance. We know Melissa very well in her role as the CEO of Insurtech UK, which is the largest formal alliance of insurtechs in the world. Melissa, it reminded me of your mission statement, and I particularly love this, and it's very you, to transform the insurance industry through the use of technology and make the UK the leader for insurance innovation. Not one of the leaders, but the leader. And I can imagine you personally just crossing out one of in the first draft. Also by David Crelley, who's the data ethics lead at Admiral Group PLC, one of our clients here at Clifford Chance. David's advised on the ethics surrounding numerous data projects and leads the data ethics team, who provide an independent review of predictive models and AI. David was also the winner of Admiral's Data Community Data Leader Award 2023. So congratulations, David. But we're very lucky to have you join us today, along with Desi Savova, who is a partner at Clifford Chance in our Paris office and head of the firm's tech group in continental Europe. And I'm continually trying to recruit her into the insurance sector group, and the more she knows about it, the keener she is. So you're also very welcome today, Desi. And finally, but not least, Emma Eaton, a senior associate in our financial institutions group here in London, and one of the leaders in our insurtech sector focus across our global network. So now the introductions are done, onto the questions. So I think I'm going to start with David with probably the widest question I could think of. This is a building block, but I know that there's various discussions around this. So how would you define AI?
Oh, yes, that's always the fun one. So if you look at Wikipedia, it will tell you that AI is basically a machine doing things that typically people would do, which, let's be honest, is a pretty terrible definition. And by that definition, you can actually go all the way back to the Second World War with people like Alan Turing, and what they were doing could be defined as AI. So I think we've got to take more of a practical approach to it, and the way that we kind of look at it is there's kind of 2 main areas. So it's predictive analytics. So around the 1990s, you had these horrible people called data scientists that were very awful people like myself. And what they were doing, they started using quite complicated algorithms to predict how people were going to behave. So the problem with these techniques is they're quite difficult to understand actually what's going on inside the algorithms. And sometimes they appear to have this very godlike ability to make very accurate predictions, but you couldn't always say why that was. Now, Following on from that, kind of recently, I think everyone has kind of got on board the ChatGPT hype. We've kind of entered this world around the generative AI, which actually is based on some of the algorithms before. So things like neural network are now using to do things, predict, instead of just making an output, which is a number, so how likely someone's to do things, starting to produce kind of videos and texts. So it's anything kind of which produces an output which you don't fully understand exactly what is going on inside the box in order to make the decision. And that's kind of the practical definition we use as a business.
Great, fantastic. And can you give us some use cases where Admore is using AI? And I'm thinking they're more customer-facing as opposed to internally within your organization.
Yeah, no, so I think it's probably fair to say that, just to kind of reduce some of the hype slightly, AI has been within insurance tech for a very long period of time. I think we've got about 150 predictive models, so that's kind of that kind of more old-fashioned AI in the business, and that does things like predicting motor risk, what kind of emails people are going to open, how many call center operatives are going to be working on a Saturday. It does that kind of stuff, and it's done that quite successfully for a while. I think it's probably fair to say that most people looked at ChatGPT, thought this was a wizard, and then since then have been trying to think about how they can actually use that and incorporate that into their business. So I think there was kind of a massive excitement and then a pause moment where everyone's kind of trying to work out how to use this. So at the moment, we are actually kind of in an RD&D kind of position. So we've got a number of initiatives ongoing at the moment looking about how we can actually use this technology, so, and focusing on what we can do to make it more beneficial for the customers. So there's tests around, can we make our content more tailored to people's needs? So that would be email communications, kind of responses out to customers sending in emails. Can we use this to speed up some of the processes? And then we've also kind of doing some more of kind of innovative sort of experiments using things like dashboard cams to see if we can actually use that information to help speed up our claims processes. So as I say, it's very much in the kind of experimental stage. And the reason why that's really important is as it's a new technology, you need to think through not just what is the regulation, not just can we do this, but actually what can potentially go wrong. So it's one of these things you need to think through, what is the best for the customer, make sure you've got the checks and balances in place so it works. Because it's new, you don't necessarily want to be rushing in and putting things public-facing. So we're starting with a lot of kind of internal uses. So everyone's using Copilot, but we're also thinking about can we use this to look through regulation? Can we use it for summarizing large documents? That kind of stuff, because that's more low risk. What you don't particularly want to do is rush and put things directly in front of your customers. But we are currently in that experimental stage, and eventually customers will get more used to things like chatbots for out-of-hours services, etc. So these things are coming, but you've got to introduce it in a way that your customers actually are responsive to, and we don't want to scare people.
Okay. I mean, that's incredibly helpful to understand. I mean, we'll come back and we'll talk a bit later, I think, if we can, on testing and how you go through some of those processes. But, I mean, Melissa, we've certainly heard from David from one organization's perspective. Within InsurTech Your.Care, you're hearing a multitude of different voices. What are you hearing from your members on use of AI and their use of it, I think?
Well, thank you again for your intro. And I'm definitely behind that mission statement. Yeah. We want UK to be the best. And so we have in our association over 100 InsurTechs who are members. So it's a plethora of companies to remember how they're all using technology. But they are, a lot of them, as you can imagine, using AI. And I have some interesting examples to share with you. So we have a group of them using AI to predict climate risk, which I think is really interesting. So some of them are using it to analyze multiple sources of data, and then they can show and predict when a flood or another weather event is going to occur, and actually help people take steps to mitigate that risk and prevent, further damage. So I think that's a great example of how InsurTechs are using the latest technology to actually help people and achieve better outcomes for people, for businesses, for society. So that's one example I'd like to kick off with. Some other examples more specific to insurance, sort of more in the B2B context, go towards the processing of claims and underwriting of risk, and just making that whole process easier. So for the incumbents, this has been, a difficult journey, and the insurtechs want to disrupt that. They want to make it possible to match brokers with underwriters who want to underwrite specific types of risks at the touch of a button. And there are some examples in our membership who are using this algorithmic underwriting very successfully. I mean, I can name names. Artificial Labs, for example. They are making huge inroads in the commercial and specialty market. We have another company called InsureX, who is using the AI to do the matching, and they've created a marketplace so that allows for matching, and also for smart follow for reinsurance, which again, could unlock incredible amounts of data exchange, and then the ability to underwrite more esoteric risks, because it just makes it that much easier to find a buyer for that risk. So I just think that it just goes from the B to C, the customer-facing opportunities, to the sort of more specialist, high-end opportunities, and everything in between. And I've got a few more examples here to share with you as we go through.
I mean, I think that's fascinating when you think about how varied the industry is, because, I mean, we haven't really touched on life and health, and there are obviously opportunities there too, but across the customer journey, there must be AI use cases, and across the industry, whether it's retail, as you say, or global specialty business, or just matching buyers and sellers, whether they're the brokers and the largest underwriters, are there ways to use AI to facilitate that business? I think to move on, I think, and we'll do the science bit now, if that's okay with everyone, and move on, I think, to Desi and Emma. Desi, what's the status of AI regulation in the EU? I know that the EU is more prone to legislation rather than the UK. So can you tell us a little bit about where we're at?
You're right. The EU has a very strong reputation in terms of really willing to regulate everything, not necessarily the same reputation in terms of being a strong innovator. But the EU regulation around AI, the AI Act you may have heard about, has been seen as a game changer in terms of trying to go for a comprehensive, horizontal, and cross-sector regulation with the very strict rules applicable to the design, development, distribution, and use of AI, not only in Europe, but also globally. So what's the current status, Ashley? Well, it has been a very long process, because the Commission, the first time we heard about the draft AI Act was in 2021, with ambition on the Commission side to have the AI Act adopted very quickly. So 2.5 years later, we are almost there. And the adoption of the AI Act is really imminent. There is just one last milestone, which is expected to be achieved next week, 21st of May. So companies and organizations must really prepare. Adopting the AI Act doesn't mean it will apply immediately. It will actually apply gradually to businesses, with the first obligations kicking in as soon as 6 months after entry into effect. And we can come back to the type of obligations that will apply. But just to simplify it, the first type of restrictions that will come into play will be about prohibited practices, and I'll come back to this point a little bit later, and about literacy obligations, really making organizations accountable about upskilling the resources and teams and measures taken internally in terms of ensuring that the right competence exists within the organizations able to deal with the risk that AI is raising, as David was rightly pointing out. Then we'll see gradual application of other obligations, such as general purpose AI models and systems will be regulated in 12 months. The so-called high-risk AI systems, and we'll come back to that because this is one of the use cases that is very typically seen as important for the insurance industry. They will be, start to apply 24 months later, and the last obligations will kick in 36 months later. So we still have time, but it is time to start prepare for it. It doesn't mean that nothing will happen between now and the first obligations. What we see actually happening at the moment is around guidelines being developed, codes of conduct being pushed forward. Another initiative that is being launched by the EU authorities is the so-called AI Pact. It's really a system whereby the organizations will adhere at a voluntarily basis to the principles covered by the AI Act. The reason why I'm saying that is actually that it will be quite important for businesses to monitor what will be happening in the coming months and being vocal and to the fullest extent possible being involved in the secondary legislation that we'll be seeing, no doubt, coming.
Thanks, Desi. You touched on one point there around so the classification system and the high grading. Can you tell us a little bit about that classification system and why it matters for insurers?
Yeah, so one of the core principles on which the AI Act is based is really the so-called risk-based approach. The AI Act covers all sectors, all AI systems, but the willingness there is really to adapt the measures depending on the risks that an AI system is raising. So I'll go to two areas, and thank you for the question, Ashley. One is prohibited practices. So prohibited practices actually can be quite wide-ranging. To give a few examples here, not necessarily typical for the insurance industry, but still relevant. It is everything around social scoring that will be considered as being prohibited to the extent driven by AI system. Another example I hear a lot being given by friends and clients from insurance companies is around emotion deduction at the workplace and at educational places, because emotion detection is very quickly to be considered as taking place. Someone reacting with an artificially generated content and system can be the subject of emotion recognition. This will be prohibited. Now, going back to your specific question around high risk, this is really at the core of the AI Act. So these are lists of practices considering as naturally raising high risk for society, fundamental rights, health, and environment. Key examples here will be AI systems used to assess credit worthiness or credit scoring of people, or to go to the insurance world, everything around risk assessment and pricing of health and life insurances. So obviously very wide-ranging. Another example, which is actually sector agnostic, but very relevant for the insurance industry as far as the internal use of AI is concerned, is around HR. So AI systems used for promotion, recruitment, termination, assessment of the workforce is considered to be high-risk systems and therefore subject to quite heavy and strict obligations and monitoring by the authorities.
Thanks, Desi. Emma, very different approach in the UK, I think, at the moment. So do you want to chat through that with us? I mean, there's no specific legislation as yet.
Yeah,
I think that's something
right.
that you can talk to us about.
Yeah, so the UK government published a white paper and an update to that in February, and they've set out 5 principles for the FS all regulators, but just concentrating on the FS regulators here, for the sectoral regulators to interpret and apply to their remit. This reflects the UK's approach, which is it's sector-led, so it's up to the individual regulators in each of the different sectors to say, this is how I'm going to design my AI framework, but having regard to the principles. And those principles are not on a statutory footing at the moment. They're there to, as I say, to support the regulators in designing their AI frameworks. So it's still up to the PRA and the FCA to come up with the actual, rules and guidelines themselves. These principles have arrived at a time when the FS regulators have already spent years working on AI risks and trying to understand them. So just giving some examples that the audience will probably be familiar with. They've done 2 machine learning surveys already. We've had the sandboxes, discussion papers, the AI Public-Private Forum. That's just to name a few things that they've done. So the government's paper and the principles might have accelerated some of the work that the regulators have been doing, but it's certainly improved the transparency because both regulators were required by slightly different government departments to provide an update to their strategic approach to AI regulation, and they both published on the same day, about 3 weeks ago, and both confirmed that their approach of AI agnostic regulation is the right way to deal with AI risks as far as they're concerned at the moment. It's a moving feast, so this isn't the end of the story at all. It's just an update that they've provided. There's an awful lot of work that's going on in parallel. To name but a few things, there's the DRCF, so the Digital Regulation Cooperation Forum. They're going to look at the nascent AI auditing market. You've got the 3rd machine learning survey coming up. You've got the review of the consumer duty for vulnerable customers, proposals for critical third parties, even though that's not AI specific, it could ultimately extend critical AI providers. The PRA is considering extending model risk management principles to insurers. And the other one I probably should mention is the private members bill that's going through Parliament. So that passed the House of Lords stages on Friday and is now moving to the Commons. And this is where the UK might end up having some actual legislation, although the bill is far, much more simple than the EU AI Act. But it includes things like establishing an AI authority, requiring companies to have an AI officer, and these are things that are not specifically required by the FS regulation at the moment. So there's a lot to still keep on top of, but at the moment what you have to do is apply existing rules and regulations to your use of AI. So the fact that we don't have a statute does not mean that AI is not regulated in the financial services sector, because it is.
Yeah. And you talked about the 5 key principles from the UK AI policy paper, and just for everyone's benefit, just to list them, it's safety, security and robustness, transparency and explainability, fairness, accountability and governance, and contestability and redress, which not much left out there, I wouldn't have thought. I mean, can you give us an example? And I think you make the point as well, which is that the regulators and government have pointed out to existing UK legislation to support and underpin. Can you give us an example of how those current rules apply to, say, one of those principles?
Sure, and I should also say that as well as FS regulation, there's of course other laws and regulations that apply to the use of AI, and people will be very familiar with Data Protection and Equalities Act requirements, so it's not just FS requirements that apply to insurers and intermediaries. I think I'd take the fairness principle probably, because that's one that seems to have caused a bit of concern, judging by some of the comments in the feedback statement that was published in autumn. There were a few areas where people were saying they'd like a bit more guidance about how the fairness principle applies to financial services, because it does intersect with fairness principles under other laws like Data Protection and the Equality Act. So the principle is, don't undermine legal rights, and your AI shouldn't discriminate unfairly. So the first part about undermining legal rights is really make sure your AI is not causing you to breach laws like the Equalities Act laws or the Data Protection law. So don't use data that uses protected characteristic information, for example, unless it's exempt. The other part of it, the don't discriminate unfairly. So the fairness principle certainly falls more within the FCA's remit than the PRA's remit. So the FCA has given a bit of an explanation of the kind of rules that already apply to fairness. So they would be threshold conditions and principles of business. But in the retail sector, of course, predominantly the Consumer Duty. And the Consumer Duty addresses bias and discrimination in a couple of ways. So you've got the rules about acting in good faith and trying not to cause foreseeable harm. And then you've got the fair value outcome. So there's quite a few areas of the Consumer Duty that relate to discrimination and bias in your AI. And it doesn't mean that you can't charge the same, that you have to charge the same premium, for all of your customers. Of course, that's not what it's saying. It's about making sure that you can justify why you are charging a different price.
So, I mean, I think there's a lot of attention on fairness and bias, and I think that's absolutely understandable. I mean, David, from your perspective, how does Admiral think about this? I mean, obviously, it's always on everyone's radar, particularly retail insurers, so that's not new, the compliance with the Equality Act, but in the context of AI.
Yeah, everyone wants to do the right thing. And I think that if we look at insurance, it's the process of discriminating people, different risks. So this person's a higher risk than that person. It's very fine line to make sure you're not discriminating, if that makes sense. And I think that as an insurer, we're very aware that actually there is a correlation in the world, which is population density correlates with accidents. If there's more people around, you're more likely to have a motor accident. Unfortunately, due to a range of societal issues, that will also correlate with a range of diversity. So therefore, you've got to take everything very, very carefully. So we have a whole range of processes in place to look at the outputs of these models. So the most important thing with fairness is it's got to be a conversation. It's not just a mathematical thing. It's a conversation to say, this is what the model is saying. Does this feel right? Is this fair? Would the customer think this is the right thing to do? I always have one rule in my back of my head, which is, could I walk into the house of somebody that's being charged a higher price, and I'll be able to sit down, explain it to them, and not be punched? I know that's a very low bar for people, but actually that ability to understand what your AI is doing, visualize it, understand who's got the highest premium, look at where any errors are, make sure all those are taken place, but then actually have that information available to all the people that make the decisions. So you've got to have the conversation, and the reality is there's not a lot of data science and AI expertise out there. So you've got to take additional steps to visualize the outputs of what you do. And once you visualize it, you can then have the conversation, and that's the most important thing to do.
And that, by its nature, sort of ties in one of the other principles of explainability. So your sort of punching threshold of customers is probably, it's another way of putting that, of transparency. Can you explain it? Can you understand it yourself in your model? I mean, Melissa, what else are you seeing in terms of other hot topics as well as fairness or unfairness and bias?
Yes, I think that going back to the point about insurtechs wanting to be disruptors, wanting to make change, what they're, a lot of what they're trying to do is make insurance better for people, like you said, doing the right thing and bringing better outcomes to customers. It really drives a lot of these, insurtechs are, there's always an entrepreneur or somebody behind each of these companies, and these individuals often are coming from a tech background, but a lot of them also come from incumbents where they sort of get frustrated with how things are done and they want to make things better and do it a better way. So I think that's the starting point, the culture inside of a lot of insurtechs. I mean, I would say the vast majority. And I think that culture drives this urge to make things fairer, to find markets that are underserved and try and help them. So to give you an example, just a simple one, embedded insurance is a hot topic. So it's sort of that, it's a way of using AI to find new markets through third parties, groups or companies or stores or, so for example, one of our insurtechs called Laka is popping up when you buy a new bike. And that's useful for people who want to protect their 2,000-pound bike that they just bought. So this is really, this is being used as a tool to help individuals.
And when do you think they're taking account of new legislation or new regulatory interventions in this area as they're building these businesses or they're thinking through? It's the classic tension of innovation versus regulation. Is it inbuilt as they're going through, or is it something that comes later down the line as they come closer to market?
So I think I just wanted to come back on one of the points that you made, David, about being able to explain why a pricing decision is made, how much the premium is, and that again, that's what drives a lot of our members, is wanting to make insurance explainable for people, because it shouldn't be, people talk about black boxes, but the insurance industry has been a black box. No one has ever shared an underwriting philosophy with a customer in 100 years. So I think that anything we can do to explain. So I think that a lot of our insurtechs, for example, they want to reduce the question sets because they don't want you answering all these questions, because then because what they want to do is say, look, we're going to get the publicly available data about your house, for example. We can find all this out. You don't need to tell us this. We can look at various sources, and we know that you've got a shed in the back garden, and you've got this much land in this much area, and we even know how many bedrooms you have, really. So we can just underwrite that way. Mm-hmm. And that is explainable to people in a way that asking them a load of questions is not.
Yeah. I mean, Desi, when you hear this and you listen to this, and I know that amongst the various things that you look at, you're thinking about use of data. How do you think how do you see that working through, and what might those types of business need to think about as they're, for want of a better word, utilizing publicly available data from an underwriting tools perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. I would like just to go to 2 points. One is the definition you made of AI. One of the challenges that businesses are facing is really defining AI. And I really like the definition you made, and the fact that people can understand what AI means. One of the challenges under the AI Act has been, and the central issue has been the very definition of the AI, because at the beginning, the EU regulator went for a very wide definition. Basically, every Excel sheet could have been an AI system.
Yep.
We are still with a very fragmented approach at the global level, and I guess that's not a very good news for businesses and organizations, but it is improving. So one thing I wanted to mention is that in the very final version of the AI Act, the definition that has been adopted is similar to what you were explaining, David, and actually is the definition that the OCDE has been applying. So we see a trend towards a globalization and adopting common concepts throughout the world. The other point is about the principles you talked about, Emma. So there are 5 here in the UK. We have the same principles under the AI Act, but we have a few more on top of it. As always, we love regulating. So companies need to think about accountability. And this is one of the points back to your question, Ashley, around use of data. Some of you who have had to deal with the GDPR implementation are very familiar with that. Companies are made responsible and accountable for the use of AI, including the use of data, because obviously data is at the core of AI, and there are some tensions between one of the core principles under the AI Act, privacy, and then AI, because developing AI does go with using huge quantities of data. The AI Act went for a very conservative approach and imposed strict obligations in terms of the quality of the data and the security of the data that companies and organizations will need to ensure. I'll add one more point, which is the principle of AI needing to ensure the societal and human well-being. That's quite a vague concept, and I'm sure we'll need further guidance as to what exactly it means, but it is at the core of the EU values that we see in many legislations. Last point, human oversight, and it goes again around the use of data, transparency, accountability. This is one of the core principles. As soon as organizations are using high-risk AI, the human oversight will need to be at the core.
I was going to say the human in the loop one's a very interesting point. I'm going to say personally, you always need to have that human conversation. I am a psychologist by training, and I can say one of the problems is people are spectacularly lazy. So it's about one of these things about how you can actually make the accountability and continual, because the system might be right 999 times out of 1,000. You don't necessarily, when it's going to go wrong, when do people become too comfortable? So it's about how you get that friction in the systems as well to make sure the human oversight works correctly.
There's been quite a lot of focus in some of the thoughts on regulation around governance and what's the appropriate system of governance. And I mean, Emma mentioned it in the private members bill, which is very short, like 4 pages long, something like this. Very limited, but it starts almost with, let's have some governance around this. I mean, Emma, maybe to take that to begin with, from a UK perspective, what have we heard from the regulators, or what, maybe to put it the other way, what should firms be thinking about in terms of governance and meeting those sorts of requirements?
So again, it's the same point that there's plenty of regulation already. I'm talking again about the FS context. There's plenty of regulation already that applies to governance. The CISC source book, for example, but threshold conditions again. So you would need, and the Consumer Duty has governance principles in it, so you need to be complying with all of those governance concepts. When it comes to AI, I think we're finding there's a bit of a consensus, apparently, that the risks of AI are not necessarily novel, and so your existing governance framework can probably be adapted to AI risks, and you should just focus on the particular features of your AI model that causes the most risk. And of course, your governance requirements are going to depend on the complexity. So it goes back to the definition of AI. I mean, we keep talking about AI, but a lot of people aren't truly working with this complex definition of AI. But so your governance framework can be proportionate. And then talking about the private members bill, and the AI officer concept is in the private members bill. The regulators, the FCA and the PRA haven't yet decided to impose a specific AI SMNCR function, but of course the SMNCR regime is very relevant to governance, and it's again going back to the point of accountability and having clear lines of responsibility, and whoever your function holder who's responsible to the regulators for AI in your business needs support. It's a complex area. It can't be done in silos. I'm sure, David, you'll probably be able to talk to it a lot more than I can, but they need support, and I think probably don't underestimate the cost and time it takes to produce a robust governance framework.
Is it sort of similar, Desi, in the EU approach?
Yeah, I was about to jump in, and underneath, I totally agree, Emma. It is fundamental to use the existing control frameworks, especially in the insurance sector, because there is a lot of legacy, a lot of control tools that can be used, processes. And it is interesting, but also somewhat tricky point under the AI Act. The AI Act does take into account sectorial legislation in 2 ways. One is saying whenever we have sectorial rules applicable, companies will be able to leverage these and consider that they comply with the AI Act by basically fulfilling their sectorial obligations. However, the principle is nice. The practicalities are not yet totally clear, and the references are very generic, so we are waiting for further guidance in this respect. The other thing is that actually some of the obligations under the AI Act are being assessed towards the lens of the sectorial legislation. And again, one cannot go just for applying the AI Act. It does need to be read together with the sectorial legislation, and there are many and very useful cross-references. And by the way, this goes back to the very notion of AI and the use cases. We now have quite useful guidance as to what are the use cases organizations need to focus on, what are the highest risk use cases in this respect. And this, to me, it's a useful starting point. Now, on the governance point more specifically, I totally agree. You can't deal with silos, and it is fundamental to do two things, in my view. Holistic approach, meaning you need a working group involving the stakeholders with very different background, with different objectives to ensure this diversity of views that actually is at the core of the principles of AI. That's one thing. The other point is that AI governance does need to come from the top. You have to have your board, your senior management leading by example, because AI actually exceeds everything we have done, for instance, in terms of data privacy. Data privacy is a very useful reference, but AI will be much more transformational in terms of changes that organizations need to do, and senior management needs to sponsor the AI strategy and compliance programs of companies, I think.
And just a last question on that area for you, Desi, if I can. How has the EU AI Act been received by clients when you've been speaking to them? Because I guess you're speaking across sectors as well.
Yeah, I'll start with the good news. The good news, so not answering your question. It is possible and quite important to be pragmatic about the AI Act. Companies are nervous. I can't say I know a single company which is ready for the AI Act. There is a lot of anxiety, a lot of questions. There are some wait-and-see behavior, but the majority of the clients have started thinking about their strategy, compliance priorities, resources, cost planning, as you were saying, Emma, etc. It is fundamental to keep calm and prepare in a pragmatic way, putting the right priorities in front of the right risks and the right strategy for the company. So this is a kind of indirect answer to your question. Keep calm. It will be bumpy, but I'm sure we'll go through.
Keep calm and carry on. I think I've heard that before somewhere. I mean, David, does that kind of resonate with you?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's an interesting one because obviously we talk about the AI Act being in Europe. One of the main concerns, and I think it's the elephant in the room, is we've got an election year coming up. And if you look at the TUC's website, it's pretty much their guide on AI is pretty much the AI Act from Europe. So we've got this kind of situation where we have to kind of consider both. Admiral's insurer covers places in Europe as well, but we'll also have to be thinking about the UK and businesses in order to be prepared for that as well. So we're having to design processes which are considering both elements at the same time. But yeah, it's, as I say, Admiral's in quite a good place because I've been employed there for a couple of years to be thinking about it and getting prepared. I would say that most companies should start to think about best practice and embedding these things. And I would say that also you're right, this isn't just an insurance concern, this is across the board. Every single company is going to be looking at what the best practices are, and I would say that there's not necessarily a really clear cut, you do X, Y, and Z and you'll be in a good place, and it's a lot of kind of trying to think through and kind of exploring that as well, and trying to get yourself in the best place possible. But I think it's going to be a process for the next few years of everyone refining their processes, understanding these things a bit more, and picking up the best practices as they become clearer from all the players in every industry, really.
And if I may, just 2 points resonate really very strongly. One is, the reality is every company does need to go for the key principles it wants to see being implemented internally. Obviously, for obvious reasons, because actually every company is a global player these days. And the EU AI Act actually has an extraterritorial reach, as the EU legislator loves doing these days. The second thing is, it is about adopting the best practices, and this can be done quite quickly with focus on the most important aspects.
I mean, there has been some talk of the AI Act being the new GDPR, in that Europe leads and actually it comes up with a standard that's workable and other jurisdictions follow. And I mean, Emma, have the Labour government, have the potential Labour government, sorry, fast forward 6 months, have the potential Labour government talked about their AI policy in detail?
A little, not a huge amount, but I think we've heard that we're expecting a paper on their AI strategy in the next couple of weeks, obviously part of their overall strategy in the run-up to the election. But just going back to the point that Desi was making, I think, and same with David's point, that I think there is a feeling that because the UK is not legislating, there's a risk that people are so confused about what they're supposed to be doing that they're just going to choose the EU AI Act and go with that for the time being. So,
And there's also, don't forget, the US, who a lot of our insurtechs are looking west.
Yep.
Because they want to expand into the US. That's where all the investment opportunities are as they see it. And it still has the highest level of investment into insurtech in the whole world. So the US states, as I'm sure we all know in this room, that each state has its own control over its financial services, including insurance. But there is a body comprising all the US states, which has published around AI best practice and a lot of states are adopting that approach. So I think it'll be not only looking towards the EU in the absence of any UK regulation, but also looking to the US.
Melissa, you are so right. Actually, it will be a huge mistake to only look at one region. And the reality is that regions have been competing to see what's the best way to regulate AI. The thing is that at some point a regulation is adopted and then you need to cope with it irrespective of whether that's the best way or not. So the US are quite key, but equally companies need to look at regions such as APAC. Yeah. China has been the first region actually regulating to some extent AI, and we see some other legislation applicable everywhere. So to me, two conclusions. One is companies do need to look globally at regulation. And two, the good news, the actual good news will be when we'll see real international cooperation and governments agreeing on at least the key concepts that will apply everywhere. But in the meantime, companies will need to navigate this complex global regulatory framework.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see, I think, and I think without being too cliche, we've already talked about the rules-based approach in the EU and the principles-based approach in the UK, and in the US we've already seen a class action, I think, in AI, so the more litigious US, and that's a class action based on an AI use, I think, in a life insurance or health insurance
I think, yeah.
model. So I think we're already starting to see potential complaint and potential redress if that's the way that goes. So I think it's obviously fascinating to follow and to think about. And I guess my next question is probably for Melissa. When your members hear about this and they think about their innovation and their approach and their speed to market, does any of this really concern them significantly? Do they feel that the regulation of AI could really hugely inhibit their plans and thoughts?
Yeah, I've actually been, in preparation for this, I've been asking some of our members who I've been fortunate enough to see recently at a conference up in Manchester, which is why I've just arrived. And it's an interesting response from them, because what they're saying is what keeps them up at night is keeping up with the latest AI developments. So, even if they're using it at the moment, it's like keeping that cutting edge is what really takes up their thinking time. So I think regulation is lower down their priority, especially in light of the fact that it's not exactly here yet, hitting them on the head. But the other point about it is that they are largely, there's a good chunk of them that are not actually regulated insurance entities. They're technology companies. So they're dealing with regulated entities, but it's the regulated entity who has to be concerned with the existing regulations. So that's one reason for them to kind of be off the hook. Another reason is a lot of them are not B2C, so they're business to business. And the third reason that it's less concerning for some of them is they're not actually using personal data, they're just using public source data, and just sort of extracting key points from it. So again, I think if you flip that on its head and look at the companies who are using personal data, so they're working in the life sector, let's say, they're regulated entities, carrying on and offering insurance, and their B2C. I think those are the ones who are probably knocking on your door or about to.
Yeah.
And I wanted to say that in our association, obviously we exist to help our members with navigate all these challenges, and which is why we're doing this event with you and sharing it with our members. And so we see that as our role. We also have 30 partners who work with our InsurTechs, including yourselves, which I think, they're incredibly important, because I think regulation for most of these companies, it's a cost of business, and it's not something they profess to have expertise in, but it's something they look to partners for expertise to help them navigate.
I mean, you're right, it's a hugely important part of the insurance ecosystem. New businesses, particularly InsurTechs, and I think finding ways to support them is incredibly important in this area, because it is challenging, and I'm sure you're absolutely right that at the forefront of their minds is going to be innovation and getting that competitive edge, and this will be sort of slightly lower down the list of priorities, whereas someone like an Admiral as an incumbent insurer, and you were talking about it before, David, you certainly don't see yourselves as an incumbent insurer, you've still got that startup mentality, but how do you navigate through that tension?
It's a really interesting one. So I think the most important thing that any company can do is invest, not necessarily in AI, but in human intelligence, and that sounds like a really strange thing to say, but actually the expertise to understand what AI means, how it works, understand where things can go wrong, and that expertise needs to be in your regulation and governance functions, because if you don't have that in place, it is going to be a very big, a blocker for business. So, there's always like that friction in a business in terms of we want to go and do this, it's going to be great for the customers, and then governance saying, actually, hold on, have you thought about this? You've got to kind of bring both sides in, if that makes sense. So it's probably got to cool a little bit the excitement in one side, and then cool the terror in the other side. So it's kind of like that education piece is needed, and then you just end up in a nice place in the middle. So I think probably what I'd say for any insurer is don't just think about AI, but think about the people and the intelligence side of it, and get your training programs in place now, because that's going to be a real competitive advantage to have governance people that understand this regulation.
That's very thoughtful. We've got, I think, just 5 or 6 minutes left. Do we have any questions in the room?
Yep.
We'll hear you a little bit better in about 5 seconds, though, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's Tahir Sayani here from HSBC, and I sit in the compliance unit team. So one of the things which I was interested to know that the quality of the regulations, we have talked about, there's a little bit of uneasiness in the market, the way, the regulations are coming, but how good they are in terms of what the sound which has come so far. So for example, one of the pain area for us is the dealing with the vulnerable customers and whether they have been, taken care of. I was talking this afternoon, around, the speech to text discussions, that how we are going, to deal with those things. So from that perspective, I just wanted, to ask, how the quality is in terms of what regulations are coming. They are detailed enough, they are, good enough so far, what we have seen. And also a little bit, around the harmony and the consistency of, the regulations across, because these are all extraterritorial and they impact each other.
Yeah. I mean, maybe just sort of to pick up on that second question, I think if I understood it correctly, it's around the consistency of regulations as they impact AI, and I think we've talked a little bit about that, but I don't know whether, Desi, you want to sort of pick that one first?
I think this is a real question, a very good one, and hence the importance for organizations to go for the common denominator at this stage. That would be my recommendation. And then look at the highest risk. under the EU AI Act, because this is something, at least we know it's there tomorrow, and it's unavoidable. But regulations are not necessarily consistent. You're right, they do have common denominators. We do have industry best practices in place and guidelines, and I think a pragmatic approach is still possible. Not an easy one, but possible.
I mean, we've seen some of the larger global organizations, for example, and I've seen a slide, the one of them put together, which was, we are going to set up an AI body that we've talked about. We are going to come up with our own set of principles with an ear to global regulation, but what we believe are the appropriate set of principles for our business, and they could be inclusive of the 5 that we've talked about, but possibly others. And then we are going to think about specific legislation as we go through and we build, but it's going to be largely, we think we set up our committee, we think we set up our principles ourselves, and that's how we're going to adopt it. We've also had a lot of stress, I think, from some of the largest organizations on what is AI. I mean, they've spent, I think, some of the months, if not longer, debating internally which are their models that fall within the ambit of these committees, and which part of the organization takes the lead on it. So I think there has been a lot of discussion. Does it start with a tech team? Does it start with a data team? Does it start with a risk and compliance team? And I think the answer is it starts with a team, and they've all got to listen to each other and work together almost in exactly the same way that David talked about, because if you're not working together, you're going to really struggle with any one of those being over-dominant. You're going to have a challenging situation. And anybody else in the last? Yes.
Hi there, it's Beth. I'm from Chubb, but I'm actually seconded to Clifford Chance at the moment. I just have a question. I think it was mentioned earlier that training staff in AI literacy is a competitive advantage for companies. Do you think one of the challenge for insurers or just companies alike is more training staff, or is it investing in technology to have like more efficient systems, like the climate risks that you mentioned earlier, so having that technology there, or is it more the investment on staff, which is obviously a provision in the EU AI Act?
I was going to say, I don't think you can disentangle the two things. You need to have efficient systems, but you need to have trained staff to use it. Like, I'm going to say this, AI is kind of a bit like a hammer, which is actually, it's a really useful tool for so many different activities imaginable. I've yet to find a good use for one in the kitchen. So it's one of these things with any tool, you've got to train the people that are going to use it so they can make good decisions about where it's appropriate to use, how to use it, and stop them hurting themselves with it, really.
Very good. I think the hammer and the punching analogy are one
right.
we're going to remember. So, any other questions before we close off today? No. Well, thank you for both of those excellent questions, much appreciated. And thank you to the panelists for your valuable insights, and really appreciate your time. Appreciate you coming down from both Cardiff and Manchester, and just about, thanks to both of you had, well, actually, Desi, all 3 of you who are traveling by train had some challenges today. So thank you, all of you, for coming. And we really appreciated that. This is a very weird thing to have to end with, but the verification code for the New York CLE credit is AI Insurance, capital A, capital I, and lowercase for the rest. But thank you very much, everybody, for coming here in person. There are drinks for the real people now to come and join us, and you back at your desk or at home can do what you like now. It's 6 o'clock, so you're done for the day. So thank you very much for your time, and really appreciate it.
Thank you.